CBS News has been polling Americans on the impeachment inquiry ever since it was opened. And today we have a new poll. It shows that even after the testimony and debate over the articles of impeachment in the House committee, still less than half, 46% of Americans feel that the president deserves to be impeached over his actions related to Ukraine, versus 39% who say he does not, and 15% say it is too soon to say. Joining us to talk about what's happening here and also give us some insight into the race for the Democratic presidential nomination are CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto and CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Good to have you both here.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
So, Anthony, it looks like no clear winner to this argument.
No dramatic movement on those numbers. And this week we asked, in particular, do you find these arguments convincing that it was abuse of power that the Democrats are making? And that comes out split. Do you find that the argument that the president obstructed Congress convincing? And people are split. So there's a mixed bag here. And I want to emphasize, it's not that people in the poll feel that what allegedly went on was proper. They don't. And they do find the Democratic arguments a little more convincing than the Republican ones.
And on that particular question, people are just sticking to party line votes.
I think the way this has tracked the whole way is that views on impeachment are more or less just related to whether or not you think the president is doing a good job in the first place.
Ed, Speaker Pelosi was reluctant to start impeachment in the first place. There is a political cost to all of this. Have we calculated what it'll be?
Well, it seems to be minimal. I've been struck by the fact that all of these vulnerable Democratic freshmen have essentially held firm on this issue. And I think this number here proves it, that if you voted for a Democrat last year, you're for impeachment. Therefore, there's enough support for them back home, so long as Congress is doing other things, which is why we're going to see them pass the trade deal this week, make sure the government keeps the lights on, is working on issues like prescription drug prices. The only fallout, and if this is the only fallout, it's telling, is this Congressman Jeff Van Drew from southern New Jersey is essentially, or we're told, probably going to switch from being a Democrat to a Republican in the coming days. It's a Republican district. He's taken some hits back home for it. And the party showed him some internal polling that found because he voted against starting the impeachment inquiry, his support among Democratic voters bottomed out. So he's just going to roll the dice, as he might in Atlantic City in his district, and going to switch to become a Republican. But if that's it, Democrats probably in good shape.
And ultimately, we know Democrats with the majority are going to vote to impeach.
Yes.
No, this isn't going to change any kind of math there. Let's take a look now at the Democrats running for president in 2020. Our new Battleground Tracker poll surveyed likely Democratic voters in the March 3rd primaries. That's Super Tuesday, and there are 14 contests. Close to a third of the delegates will be decided on that day. It is key. The top tier here, not a surprise. Former Vice President Joe Biden is on top with 28% of voters' support. Senators Elizabeth Warren right behind him at 25%, with Bernie Sanders at 20%. But we do have a new candidate in our second tier. After South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who has 9% support, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg comes in at 4%. With entrepreneur Andrew Yang, Senators Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker tied with 3% support, and the rest of the field comes in with 2% or less. So, Anthony, this was a gamble for Michael Bloomberg. Does this mean so far it's paying off?
Well, it's key, Super Tuesday, not just for the big delegate haul you mentioned, but because that's where Michael Bloomberg is trying to enter this race, coming in after those early contests of, say, Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, you mentioned that he's in 5th place. One of the things that's interesting is you look at this and you see the Democratic Party a lot through the lens of his entry, which is to say, if you look at the liberal side of the Democratic Party, people who are more inclined to support Elizabeth Warren, support Bernie Sanders, they look at his entry and they say, well, it shows that wealthy people might have too much influence in politics. But he's pulling a little bit more from Joe Biden, a little bit more from Pete Buttigieg, and moderates are more inclined to look at that and say, well, it means he's independent from big donors, all that spending that he's doing there. So you see that, and you see him doing a little bit better with people who say that the party is going in too liberal of a direction. The trouble for him, of course, is that that's not most Democrats. Most Democrats think the party is just about right in its campaign direction.
And this was a unique strategy for Bloomberg. Is it paying off?
Well, it is risky, but he can afford to do it. Being a multi-billionaire, if you're already at 4% and you still have a little more than 2 months to go and you're advertising as much as he is and you're now traveling to these states and you're not devoting time and resources to those first 4 states but instead going to focus on these 14, what's to say that he doesn't at least hit the delegate threshold of 15% in some of these states and pick off enough delegates to keep going and remain a factor in the race? I was struck he held an event across the river here in Northern Virginia on Friday. A handful of people. His events have been quite small so far, mostly because they're tied to the organizations he's worked with in the past, climate control groups, gun control, mayors. This one had about 100 people, and I asked a few folks on their way out, why are you here? How did you find out about it? They heard about it from local Democrats. They're intrigued. He seems a little more charismatic than we thought. Clearly, he'd be an effective manager, which after a few years of Donald Trump, these Democrats said wouldn't be a bad thing. So we'll see. He's got time. Somebody has to test the theory that the first 4 states perhaps get too much influence. He certainly can afford to try.
But Anthony, last time we talked, you said voters were satisfied. Democrats were satisfied with the field of candidates. Now they've got more options.
And I think this relates to that strategy, too, in that we went ahead and asked people, what are you in these Super Tuesday states, California, Texas, et cetera, going to make of the results out of Iowa, out of New Hampshire? And half of them said that they use that to narrow their choices, that they use that specifically to see who is a contender. Well, that's a hurdle for anybody who tries to get in late. But at the same time, I think Bloomberg is trying to bet on the idea that there might be reticence coming out of those early states, maybe build on that idea that the party was going in too liberal a direction.
There's nervousness.
And then there's nervousness, and that's another thing that we found. We asked people, well, how do you feel about just watching this whole campaign unfold? And more people said that they felt nervous than felt optimistic about it. And specifically, electability, the idea that one of these candidates can go ahead and beat Donald Trump next fall. There's no single candidate that a majority of Democrats says is probably going to beat Donald Trump. Joe Biden does relatively best on it, but it's still not most.
Ed, he buried the lead.
Yeah.
No Democrat here is viewed as being able to beat Donald Trump.
Right, and that's Bloomberg's theory of the race too, that because nobody else can do it, why shouldn't I at least try? And so he'll try.
Thanks to both of you, gentlemen.